Hello, my name is Hussein Boone, and this is my presentation titled The Old, the New, and the Dangerous. In this piece, I consider some of what it might mean to have a synthesizer pedagogy. What would it draw from concerning existing practices? What of its past? Where would it have an opportunity to redress the imbalances of the historical record? And what would it attempt to amplify as positives? Questions that I would like to leave you with, drawn from this presentation, include: how can ideas of masculinity and femininity, which beset music and its technologies in general, be dealt with? How do practitioners and pedagogues redress the women feminize the instrument ideology that persists within research areas like science and technology studies? Is the user of a synthesizer also a synthesist, or is there a difference? In my childhood and teenage years, I encountered synthesizers through all sorts of sources, many of them in the family front room. These could be from film and television. Sounds on shows like Ironside, Doctor Who did much to introduce a younger generation to the possibilities of synthesizers and electronic music. UK TV science magazine programmes like Tomorrow's World would showcase and inform households nationwide about various scientific developments and their potential impacts. Occasionally, there would be a music technology segment.
These instrumental sounds were made electronically by one man, Michael Vickers, on a single musical instrument. It's called the Moog synthesizer. It produces sounds in a matter of minutes which would normally take radiophonic experts with their complicated equipment days of work and multiple re-recording to achieve.
Around about 1974-75, Tomorrow's World introduced me, along with everyone else in the country, to Kraftwerk's Autobahn. The single spent 17 weeks in the UK charts, reaching its peak position of number 4. I heard synthesizers on pop records, whether Chicory Tips, Son of My Father, which was an early brush with synthesizers for Giorgio Moroder, or of course Stevie Wonder's Living for the City. With the benefit of hindsight though, only one of these individuals, Moroder or Wonder, would be acknowledged as a synthesist. And over my lifetime, I would see and experience the ongoing difficulties for musicians of colour to acquire labels that seemed more readily able to fit white musicians. The label did not seem to apply to many women almost all of the time. When discussing female self-producers, the artist Caroline Polachek noted that they were subject to excessive expectations in what was already a challenging field. 3 areas that women self-producers were evaluated on, she said, were vocal chops, aesthetic presentation, and songwriting. To Polachek, these were 3 separate and time-consuming skills that should in no way be prerequisites to be considered a female producer, and arguably also to be a female synthesist. It is doubtful whether Rick Rubin is evaluated in this way. Rubin's claim of lack of skill, whether actual or merely being disingenuous, is one that any woman or person of colour are generally unable to make. These challenges, therefore, have persisted because they have always been present. They are a trans-historical presence that refuses to budge. This is further exacerbated by males, such as journalists and some researchers, who speak of women as feminizing the instrument. Does this suggest that the instrument is always male to begin with? For example, Trevor Pinch discusses Suzanne Ciani in these sorts of terms as feminizing the synthesizer and electronic music. And of course, Jones refers to this as actually a less helpful qualifier, imbuing electronic music with a masculine aura. Suzanne Ciani, when studying on her postgraduate program in the US, decided to leave academia. Having studied piano and performance, she moved on to composition. Her first composition was laughed at by her tutor and fellow classmates. They were all male, and she, the lone female. Is there anything more radical than being the only one? Philip Glass would later describe Ciani as a woman with a synthesizer, not even by name, not as a fellow composer, nor as a performer, nor even as an expert in her field, just a woman with a synthesizer. Is this a denigrating term, or does it hint at something more dangerous? In terms of sound, her work with the artist Harold Paris, who would later introduce her to Don Buchler, would provide her with an interesting foundation in designing sound for artistic purposes. Paris's requests would seem like impossible tasks to coax sound from modules. Clearly, this sort of grounding would help later when synthesizing sound for adverts like Coca-Cola, for pinball machines, or for films like The Stepford Wives.
And there was a little blank space in it. And he said, "Can you do something in there?" And I said, "Yes." I brought this big booklet, and it was in 5 road cases, and I'd have to assemble it. And I set this thing up, and it had all the wires and patches. And out came this wonderful sound that worked for them. And they used it all over the world. They didn't care that I was tuning the sub-audio harmonics of a sawtooth waveform melodically. Coke was like hitting the jackpot. That was a new realm of experience for me.
Regarding performance, Ciani made a convincing attempt at developing a performance approach with synthesizers. Her approach was one that combined composition with a small basis in what could be termed serialism, that was also capable of delivering flexible pieces that could be performed and improvised with, and each would be different from one performance to the next. Lastly, her performances were also spatialized and always performed in quad. In her touring and performance of these quadraphonic works, Ciani encountered a public that wondered whether everything was on tape, even though they could see her working with the synthesizer. More recently, she and Morten Subotnick were interviewed together, where they had a small disagreement regarding the Buchla and performances. You see, Don Buchler's goal was to create a performable synthesizer. He told Subotnick this was his goal. From Subotnick's position, he felt that the Buchla synthesizer, at best, was a useful tool for making sounds, but not a performance instrument. Of course, in the interview, Ciani pointed out to Subotnick that she had successfully devised a way to perform with it. However, Subotnick appeared not to have paid any attention to this at all. The producer Skrillex likened the human voice to a synthesizer.
Voice and mouth and like the whole structure, your skull structure is like a synthesizer, like a organic synthesizer. You know, you have your vocal cords, which create a vibration, and it travels up through the rest of your face and hits the roof of your mouth and bounces off, and depending on how you open your mouth, and those are just changing and shifting the frequencies.
Anybody can copy any synth now. You can find the synth sounds, you can find presets, but if you manipulate vocals, it's something really original.
The use of voice beyond singing takes us into the world of beatboxing. Generations of beatboxers, while still retaining their beats-type roots, have expanded into other domains. Examples of voice as synthesizer, especially with AI, is suggested in the work of Harry Yeff, also known as Reaps One, whose various interactions with AI indicates the sorts of ongoing development of the voice as instrument, but also the voice as synthetic, the voice as a synthesizer. Of course, in appreciating the work of others at the technological end of the spectrum, I am also reminded of Laurie Anderson's point that dangerous artwork can be made with a pencil. In this way, Roland Barthes, referring to the differences between a photograph and a drawing as between two cultures, is perhaps relevant here. Barthes claimed that the ethic of the drawing is not the same as that of the photograph. The aim of a drawing, therefore, is not to reproduce everything. There might be details missing, but it does so without it ceasing to be a strong message. This strong message is, I believe, what Anderson centers and challenges us with her pencil analogy. It is a point of critical thinking that can be applied to all of our music technologies and our works. Yet the idea of reproduction within Barthes's point is a problem for synthesizers, in that synthesizers are claimed to produce every sound. All of the preceding discussion provides us with some provocations to consider if we were to devise a pedagogy for synthesizers. Almost every reference has been from practitioners who have used a synthesizer in their practice. Simon Frith, on the other hand, makes the observation that synthesizers left no room for individual feel or touch. As a sort of bête noire, he described Gary Newman as one of many creeps in popular music. Whatever Frith did not see, feel, or respond to in Newman's work, other artists like Juan Atkins and Africa Bambaataa identified with these very same qualities and found them fascinating. The notion of the synthesizer as an artificial and soulless instrument, then, is a barrier in developing its pedagogy, whether in popular music or otherwise. In the early days of the Moog synthesizer, they used to send a technician, sometimes Moog himself, to work with the musicians and producers in the studio. The technicians would assist in translating the sound imagination requirements of musicians and translate this on the synthesizer. As synthesizers began to feature on more recordings, especially successful recordings, musicians started to ask the technicians to remake the sound that had been heard on the latest record. So while these synthesizers did not have any presets or memory to speak of, the idea of copying sound had already taken hold very quickly. Once Moog and his technicians were being asked frequently to just reproduce already recorded sounds, they stopped sending technicians out to the studios because they found the work boring. In many ways, we are still dealing with this situation in that many preset synths reference successful recordings such as Oxygen or On the Run, or particular artists like Keith Emerson, Rick Wakeman, Deadmau5 or Skrillex. The question here is whether the synthesizer can exist without the need of a referent. If, as is often claimed, and I've mentioned earlier, a synthesizer can make any sound, then is this part of the problem? The prepared piano transforms piano timbre into something else. How does a synthesizer, capable of making any sound, also become transformed? If we were to devise a synthesizer pedagogy, is it advantageous to operate outside of the influence of the commercial framework? The experience of Moog and his technicians within this commercial domain was one of frustration and boredom. Yet Ciani fled to the commercial world as a remedy to the issues she experienced in the academy. So would a synthesizer pedagogy be something like an architectural program, where students align themselves to particular studios, particular methods? Arguably, this happens already when students decide to study at a particular music school or university. But to do so as part of a studio practice requires that these studio practices, their approaches and aesthetics, are articulated clearly and also successful in the field. The studio practice, whilst it has led to abuses, suggests a type of situated learning approach. Yet even in Lave and Wenger's book, neglect is a potential product of the studio experience. Ciani's experience certainly suggests that academia is a frequently harsh, unreceptive, and unaccommodating place. In considering all of the varied propositions and discussions in this presentation, the question of a synthesizer pedagogy remains, especially from which perspective? Would a course accept an individual who synthesizes using their voice to produce works, or would this not be recognized as legitimate? Well, the problem for synthesizers, whether as bespoke or as commercially available instruments, is the problem of replication. The problem, in many ways, was made by two decisions. The first was Wendy Carlos's Switched on Bach, which replicated the past. And the second was also Carlos's request for a keyboard, which made the synthesizer interface both familiar and what Ryan Didak terms claviocentric, which is the dominant cultural logic. What Carlos did, along with Moog, was to make old things using new stuff. And AI, as the new kid on the block, is equally doing so, making what many refer to as new old stuff, or what Hobsbawm referred to as old things with new methods. This new old paradigm is evidence of linking the new to a formal pass, which Hobsbawm also suggests is an invented tradition. That in many ways, this invented tradition did not exist, and that continuity, because this is what is trying to be established, is largely factitious. As Pinch and Trocco outline in their introduction, and that Levengood also discusses, we find ourselves hostage to the argument that the analog equals warm and digital equals cold. The problem of being inextricably linked to production suggests that synthesizers need to be decoupled as a music production tool and the endless search for hit sounds that drives the manufacturing of commercial music instruments. The problem for a synthesizer pedagogy is that a synth can be all things and more. Yet the goal of a pedagogy, I feel, would be not to provide a defense against critics like Frith or the ideas of you only need one finger to play a thing, but instead to advocate for Laurie Anderson's dangerous art. To do so provides the justification that her pencil analogy underscores, that is, the potential for profound artistic expression, but for this artistic expression to also be understood that it could also be quite mundane. After all, I experience synthesizers in the home, first and foremost. Therefore, this potential for profound artistic expression is something that can be made using commercial tools, self-built tools, or using minimal resources. Thank you very much.